We're here with Brandon Greenberg. You might know him as DisasterNet, author of the DisasterNet blog. Good afternoon, Brandon. How are you?
Good. I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. So today we're going to talk about a number of things over the next half hour or so. Do try to ask questions along the way. There's the Q&A icon. There's also the chat icon. Click on those, type in some comments there, and we'll try to address your questions. So let's see. This is being recorded, and let me back up here. Someone asks, Cynthia asks, talk about the use of drones. So we'll see if it goes in that direction. But so Brandon, first of all, thanks for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in this field of emergency management, emergency readiness?
Yeah, it's kind of a interesting story, maybe not unlike some others as well. I ended up volunteering for my local ambulance corps in high school. And ultimately, when I went to college, that emerged into a part-time job and then a full-time job in Denver. And I really enjoyed it. But then I was also part of a federal disaster team, a DMAT team at the time, and we got deployed out to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 when that occurred. And at the end of that, I kind of had a lot more questions about how response was put together rather than how to treat a patient. And so that kind of morphed into a consulting job where I did lots and lots of different types of disaster preparedness exercises, and I got very much into the world of exclusively emergency management, also working with first responders. And then it was time to go back for my master's. And when I went back for my master's, I realized that there's a lot more questions about how information and technology can be used in disasters. And I had hooked up with the former deputy CTO of the White House, who led a class on open gov and open data. And that kind of opened my perspective a lot. And from there, I said, listen, there's a lot more to investigate, a lot more to research. And so now I switched from a master's of public administration, which I finished, and am currently in a PhD program for systems engineering and focusing on how information and technology can be better used in disasters. And actually, most recently, I am back employed full-time while I finished the PhD at a company called Obsidian, which does a kind of all-hands emergency management consulting, and technology is certainly part of that portfolio as well. And I've always had an interest in trying to communicate out this information, and that's why I have this blog, and that's why I'm talking today as well.
Very cool, Brandon. And so you kind of started at a practitioner level and volunteer, and had a variety of experiences that led you to be a consultant and academic. So what do you see as the bigger challenges in this field of emergency management?
Well, I think first and foremost, there are three big groups that I haven't really figured out how to talk to each other. And that's the academics, the technologists, and the practitioners. And each one of those groups has their own language and has their own mission in a good way. But ultimately, we all have to work, and we have to determine and figure out ways that we can better communicate with the technologists that are developing the products that we need, better talking to the academics who are doing the research that will set the foundation for the future, and the practitioners who are in the weeds every day trying to do this work.
So what approaches have you found perhaps helpful to bring together academics, practitioners, technologists? Is there a good approach there? What do you recommend in kind of bridging the gap?
I think it's a lot of networking and conversations, and also becoming smart on the other topics as well. You don't need to be the expert. If you're a practitioner, you don't need to be an expert in academia, but I think you need to really understand the purpose that academia serves. If we're talking technologists really need to understand the context in which emergency managers operate, and how difficult that can be, and how multidimensional and multi-organizational that can really get, and how scaling very quickly produces a number of different challenges. And so I think it's two things. I think it's making sure that you provide opportunities for networking and collaboration, whatever that might be, as well as trying to learn as much as you can about the other subject and kind of how they operate. Because the more you know about how they operate, the more you can leverage them for good or for what your needs are.
In emergency management, public safety, it is continuing to be the field of all things, right? So it's definitely multidisciplinary. Do you need a PhD to kind of go down that route, or what would you recommend to others to kind of be involved in this field and make a difference?
I think the best thing you can do, you don't need a PhD, but always be that continual learner, that person that's always seeking out new information, new ways of doing things, new perspectives. I recently wrote a blog post. Somebody wrote to me and said, I actually disagree. So I actually said to him, why don't you write a blog post arguing your point? And I think that's how it happens, is that conversation that takes place. And the more conversation that takes place, the more we all learn together. And I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience as an academic, looking at some of these, you mentioned a very technical, focus in remind me, systems engineering with a focus in crisis data or something to that nature. Can you talk a bit more about that and what some of the more technical problems are that you're addressing in your research?
So ironically, I'm in a systems engineering program, but the amount of technology that I specifically deal with in terms of programming is actually kind of minimal, because that's in part because much of the issues surrounding technology are not technical problems. Mm-hmm. Right? It's about how we vision what our product should be. It's about how we define what the information is that we need. So I tend to focus a lot on information management sharing. What is useful information to disaster decision makers? What kind of behavior do decision makers follow to seek out information or to share information? Why? Is that even useful? And the third part is really kind of, if we are in an interorganizational context and working with many different players, how do we ensure through policies, programs, technical programs, whatever it might be, how do we ensure that information gets adequately shared across these different organizations? And the important point about that is that it's a systems thinking perspective. Mm-hmm. It's not a technical perspective. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of saying, listen, what I do is I understand that the system that we all operate in is very complex. It's very dynamic. I embrace that through my research. And that's how I go through the PhD, and that's how I look at the lens in terms of information management and sharing.
There's a lot of noise out there in terms of information gathering, right? One of the roles of emergency management is just having that ground truth, gaining situational awareness. So in managing all of this influx of information, it's, there's just noise. How do you filter through the noise and then also find the right nuggets of information that you really need? Do you have any kind of, advice or tools or techniques to do that?
Yeah, so I must agree with you that there is a kind of a paradigm and a model of, hey, let's collect everything. It might all be useful. But that becomes extremely inefficient, and you do create information overload problems where it's very difficult to actually find the information. So You didn't have the you now have the information and it's somewhere, but now you have to spend a lot of time just to find it in this storage location. So I think what a couple things help is to kind of flip this on its side and say, listen, what do my responders need and why? And I do have some thoughts which go into depth about how we understand information requirements. I actually just posted a blog post on this. But you really, really want to get an idea of what information is useful and why. Because you want the information that you collect to solve real problems that responders are going to face. And so the more understanding that you have of what a person's role is and what they're going to do with that information, I think the more you can intuitively understand and automate what information goes where and to whom. And so there are different tools you can certainly use. There are data warehouses. These are bigger concepts that are being applied right now. There's different ways to integrate technology, but you need an information strategist to sit there and go, I want the technology to push information in the following ways. The goal of the technology is really to enable the responder with the information it provides. So the more you can provide that valuable information directly to, that would be great.
We have a couple comments on the board here.
Yeah.
One is, what resources, what published reports or studies summarize exactly what you're talking about, those things, those information requirements, or how to better manage information, for multi-agency coordination in a catastrophic disaster?
Well, I think in part I'm doing this research because there is minimal reports on this. I think there's some concepts out there of I'm blanking on the name right now. Critical elements of information, and that's a good start. But a lot of those tend to kind of be at a very organizational level, and people are the people that actually consume information, not an organization. So you want to have more depth to those essential elements of information. And in terms of published reports, the research in this has really not been there. There is research a lot on how we go about defining information needs, but that's outside of the disaster literature and outside of the disaster context. If you were to give me a repeatable process that we can iterate on, I'll tell you I'll have your information needs, no problem. If you're going to tell me, though, that every disaster is a little bit different, we have these roles that apply a lot of managerial and critical thinking, that sometimes they need to seek out information that was never provided in the first place, those methods of identifying information needs aren't really there.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So, is it true that all disasters are unique, or is there a common approach that you can take to gathering and validating, filtering information?
So as your organization, you have to think of it as an entity, as one entity. And you serve a particular mission, a particular role in that disaster. And you want to be able to take information. Actually, can you repeat that real quick?
Sure. If I could remember what I said, I started reading Susie's comment here on the board. But, speaking of repeatable processes to provide some guidance to those who are responsible for gathering information, filtering through the noise. And I think of your joint information centers, within your emergency operations center, you'll have a planning section, maybe with a situation unit. So they're charged with looking at all this information, and they're pumping out reports. So you mentioned the challenges of finding information, filtering information, and then third, sharing information. So, I'm just trying to think, what the best approach could be to help this process along.
Well, this kind of extends a recent blog post I just had on defining information requirements. And you're right, there are repeatable processes, right, that we can follow. And then but there are usually different contexts in which information is needed. And when we have typically said to technologists, hey, I need this information, they're going to go out, they're going to backtrack, and they're going to say, we got you exactly what you asked for, or close to it, or this is exactly what we got or could get, period. But that system is not complete, right? Mm-hmm. Just because you have the information that you said you had to begin with is not complete. That system, that information system that you have built, whether that's technical or together, think about that strategically, needs to embrace the fact that people are also going to seek out additional information. So how good is your technology platform for search? How easily do you make information available to others to access and to grab what they need? And there's a flexibility to the information system that you must have. It's not simply about predefining every single requirement. It's about understanding those requirements and then how people behave. And if you understand that, then you can build a more flexible and robust system that both automates delivery, it helps with filtering, and enables a decision maker to go into the system and gather the information they need based on their critical thinking, based on their cognitive processing. Because, that person is there in front of them, they're facing some sort of situation, and they need certain information that may change from disaster to disaster.
Great points. And I want to pause for just a moment and ask people to provide any links to resources that they may be aware of, because I know we have a pretty advanced audience on the line just looking at some of the names. And I have a feeling Joel was asking a leading question about some guidance that is already available out there pertaining to essential elements of information. So any links that others have to share, we'll be sure to share within the notes after this, and make sure that everyone has this information and resources. So what does it mean to be a leader in this field of emergency management? And I'm going to twist this question a little bit because each person's answering it from their own perspective. Could you talk to me about the academic, the researcher, the leadership in that area? You've mentioned that there's just not a lot of research, there's not a lot of guidance on some of this topic. So what does it mean to be a leader in the field of emergency management as it pertains to research?
I think as a leader, it absolutely means creating relationships with technologists and practitioners. You have to be able to do that. And unfortunately, the academic system is not well aligned for that, and and how professors and researchers are actually rewarded. But somebody who is a leader and who is attempting to do that, I think, is absolutely showing leadership, because that is showing an understanding of that they could potentially be looking at more practical and relevant problems that's there. And that relationship is absolutely critical. We don't necessarily want fully pie in the sky type of research, which has its merits. We also want research that the practitioners and the technologists can implement and make a difference now, not just in 10 years. But that's a tough battle to fight.
That does seem very difficult. Just thinking of any research with the turnaround there, trying to translate it from an academic journal or something of that nature to the field. There's an education piece there. There's getting people to buy into a new concept in a world of emergency management, state, local government, that they're used to doing things the way they're doing them. So I would imagine translating research quickly into operations must be quite challenging. But so we have a few minutes left here, and I just want to see if there's any questions out there on the board. As someone posted here, Susie gives an example of leadership. So I do want to just recap that here real quick. Susie says, I had a super positive experience with DC's emergency management leader several years ago when addressing wicked cold weather, precipitation, and people who are homeless. While this is a human services issue, it was managed by emergency management, and the director successfully managed the process, bringing folks along in a productive and efficient way. He taught human service folks a lot and was at the same time respectful. So that was leadership. So very, very cool real world example of leadership. Thanks for sharing, Susie. And there is a huge gap, I think, in different areas of leadership, because so often we think of leadership as the person who's in charge. And that person, especially in emergency management, is oftentimes, the 30-year veteran, maybe former police or fire chief or something, where, may not be a professional who has been sort of groomed in this era of technology and innovation, in being able to do, as you were saying, is translate that research into action more quickly. So, Brandon, as we close here, are there any final closing thoughts or things you'd like to point people to? We do have another question on the board, so we could address that. But where can we get in touch with you and learn from your wisdom as a emergency management professional?
So I think Damien actually posted a question here that I'm just reading through real quick. And he raises a good point that it is very difficult sometimes to kind of understand and connect with some of the voluntary organizations that don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the funding to kind of support some efforts. And sometimes information that is collected also ends up, even though it's collected, gets siloed somewhere and is hard to access. So how do we kind of get to the value and get people to understand the value of shared information? Mm-hmm. And I think this goes back to what I was saying about problem solving, right? It's about the problem, the mission that you're trying to accomplish, or your partners are trying to accomplish. Your system, if you draw a boundary around your organization, you're going to interface with many different organizations. And so it also behooves you to understand, what are their problems? What's going on with them? What kind of information can I give to them that would support their mission? And by virtue of supporting their mission, I'm also, again, supporting my mission as well. And so that's one way to think about it. It's just the kind of, what are your partners' information, and what problems am I addressing with this information, and trying to draw it back to that. Not just what decisions, but what problems could this help? Does it matter if I know that this is located 4 meters away or 20 meters away? Is that even a big difference for me? Some closing thoughts as well. I get a lot of questions of, if our technology was just better. Well, honestly, I think it takes a community to really push that ball forward and understand what it means for better. How do we define what better is? And that's really a conversation that needs to keep happening between technologists, academics, and practitioners. Because what I've started to see is that we're starting to outgrow our capabilities. We have a lot more advanced analytic capabilities, but if we can't get the data for that, then we're only going to limit ourselves in terms of what we can get analyzed. So I think we really got to think about that. And then on top of that, we need to have a good understanding of what our system is like and how it interfaces with others. you're not just one unit, you're one cog in a wheel of the larger emergency management system. So how can you serve your needs and other people's needs at the same time? And part of this is understanding the policies that you put in place around information and data. We have a tendency to understand policies in terms of how they ensure privacy and how they ensure security. But we also need policies that really speak to sharing. What are those consistent policies that really help us share information while preserving privacy and security? We need that focus, and that's a mental shift from locking down information to opening up information. Because the more information we have, the more we can start to work with and see how it can also be valuable. So those are some kind of closing thoughts I had on that. The last part is I do blog, and I'm trying to blog a little bit more, at least once a week these days. And I try and talk about information and technology issues. And a lot of it is it's not very technical because I don't think all the issues are technical. And so what I'm going to do right now is I am putting together, I have a couple of links for you guys. You can follow my blog here, which I just put that in the chat room. You can understand some of my philosophy. And I think I also wrote a recent article that may be useful to some folks on information requirements as well. So the blog is really the best way to get a hold of me, which has all of my social media information. And I think there's even a button on there to email me or a form to email me directly. And if you do want to stay informed of kind of the latest information and technology, you can also, I put out a weekly newsletter as well that has all the information, curates a lot of stories from each week regarding information and technology.
Very good. Well, thank you, Brandon. I've been a consumer of yours for a while, so I really appreciate you sharing. And I think this does, some of the work you do does address one of these major challenges, which is getting academic and technical information in the hands of responders and operators, at the local level. So thank you for the work you do. Really appreciate it.